What's happening, guys? Dan Debenham here, and today is Just the Facts Friday. Today we're going to try and keep it to 2 minutes if we can, very short and sweet. Today we are going to be talking about frame rates. Let's make that happen. Okay guys, welcome back. So, frame rates. What are we using and how do we use it? Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 frame rates today. We're going to talk about 24 frames a second, we're going to talk about 60 frames a second, and we're going to talk about 30 frames a second. The video that you're watching at the moment is shot in 24 frames a second. Now you may look at your camera and you might say to yourself, I'm going to 24 frames a second. I have got something slightly close to it, but it's not the same, which will be 23.976 frames a second. Well, that's roughly the sort of equation to 24 frames a second, and that's what you would use. 24 frames a second is used to make things look a little bit more cinematic. It's slightly slower, it has got slightly less frames than everything else. It doesn't bode or use well in fast moving environments like sports, etc., because there is a lot of frame jitter to those pieces of footage. You can see from this here, it's fine to a talk piece to camera on a 24 frames a second. Lots of cinematography, lots of cinema films are filmed at 24 frames a second, specifically like sort of the vocal parts where they've got monologues and so on and so forth. And as you can see, it does make it look a little bit more pleasing to the eye. And it's just how things are. Where would we use that? We would use it in this situation where you aren't using too much motion, you're cutting from one scene to another, and it's a straight cut or there are things in between that. But the actual camera itself doesn't have a massive amount of high speed motion. So sort of whip pans, etc., they wouldn't sort of fare too well with 24 frames a second. You wouldn't use it on, say, a GoPro shooting point of view drone, etc., it's whizzing about left and right, up and down, because you just get massive amounts of jitter. It would just show up as huge amounts of jitter. 30 frames a second. 30 frames a second is basically what you would normally see on YouTube. You normally see that on TV. Most TV shows are filmed at 30 frames a second. And that is sort of the standard rate for sort of general use, effectively. As you can see from the footage here, I've shot in the back garden. That all is shot in 30 frames a second. It holds up quite well, although it does give a slight video type appearance to it. You do get that sort of video style look to your footage. And this all depends obviously on what it is that you're wanting your footage to look like and how you're wanting your viewer to feel while they're watching your footage. 24 frames a second is a little bit more emotive and feels a little bit more high value, of a little bit more high value production. Say for instance you're shooting a wedding or you're shooting a party of some kind, you probably would use 24 frames a second because the production value after that seems like it's a little bit more glossy and a little bit more high value, whereas 30 frames a second would look a little bit more like you shot a video rather than a film. But for this instance, for this situation, 30 frames a second holds up very, very well. These aren't just to point out, these 3 frame rates aren't the only 3 frame rates. I'll touch on some others in a moment. 60 frames a second, as you can see from the footage that we're going to show now, that is 60 frames a second. That is more what you would see lifelike through your own eyes at 60 frames a second. And that covers very fast movement, is great for YouTube in most parts for slowing things down if you want to do a little bit of slow motion, because you can push out 60 frames a second and then slow it down by at least 50%, and you get half the speed that you're going for. There are other frame rates that you can use. There are 120 frames a second, 240 frames a second. 120 is very, very good for slow motion. You get a very nice, smooth slow motion that's not too slow, but it's not too fast either. And so you catch quite a lot of detail with that. Other countries, such as here in the UK, primarily would use 25 frames a second and 50 frames a second rather than 30 and 60. Although I personally shoot 30, 60 and 24. They also use 24 frames a second as well, and there are various other footage frame rates going right up to into the thousands of frames a second. For that, you need obviously a specialist high-speed camera. As you can see, it all has its place. It all has interesting applications for your footage. I just wanted to clarify and sort of clear up roughly where these things will be used. 60 frames a second will go back to now. That would be used for things like sports, where there are fast moving action scenes, the camera moving to and from, back and forth, etc. It allows, because of the extra frames, allows the camera to pick up and the viewer to see the fast moving action in a very smooth and continuous way. I hope this was useful and helpful. It's very, very quick. That's what Just the Facts Friday is. I don't want to get into all this, barbering on. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it interesting. And if you did, please do like and subscribe below. It is down there. Go on, press it now. And I will see you guys next time.